Hello everyone and welcome to another video from Roman election forecasting. As of the day I'm recording this, we're only 9 days out from the election, so this is a pretty exciting forecast for the US Senate. Without further ado, let's get into it. I already have all the safe states, meaning states where the respective party has over a 99% chance of winning, filled in, and I'm going to move from states that are where I'm more confident to less confident in my predictions for the outcome. So first, we're going to start with states in the likely Democratic column. That means that Democrats have between an 80 to 99% chance of winning in these states. And as we start out here, you see that Democrats have 42 seats and Republicans have 47 seats. So basically, what that means is, unless there's some gigantic polling miss where this is a big wave election in favor of the Republicans or for the Democrats, at worst, the parties are going to be guaranteed at least these number of seats. But let's go back to the likely Democratic column, as I was saying. The first state I want to talk about is Maryland. Now, Maryland is a very interesting state because normally it would not be talked about in a competitive Senate race like this. Kamala Harris is going to win Maryland by around 30 points. The reason we're even talking about this at all is because the former governor, Larry Hogan, is running in the state. And Hogan is a sort of anti-Trump, moderate to liberal Republican who is somewhat popular among Maryland's population, but the issue for him is he's not running for governor anymore. He's running for a federal office, and in a federal office where partisan votes matter, particularly a vote on the codification of Roe v. Wade, should Kamala Harris become president, that's going to be a very motivating factor for Democrats in this state. You've also seen the dynamic between Alsobrooks and Hogan become somewhat racialized. Alsobrooks is a black woman, and because of that dynamic where she's doing a lot of outreach to black voters, I think she'll do well enough in Baltimore to relatively easily carry the state. In the end, I think the polls are going to be pretty accurate here. Alsobrooks, as she's just campaigned about just being a Democrat basically, has risen and risen, and I would give her a 95% chance of winning this seat. I could see the range. This is a difficult state to call in terms of the margin. I think there's a higher amount of variance here, so I'm going to say the outcome falls anywhere between +7 to +15 points for her, with a median at 11 points. So I think right around the polls. Up next, we're going to talk about Nevada. This is a seat where, at the presidential level, it's quite competitive. It's basically a statistically dead heat, with neither candidate having a significant lead here. I think on 538, it's actually below 0.5 for Trump. So, truly a statistically dead heat. In the Senate, that's not so much the case. If we look at the polling here, Jacky Rosen has been doing very well against Sam Brown this entire time. You have to go back when Joe Biden was the nominee for this race to even barely be within a generous margin of error. But at this point, Rosen has expanded her lead, and this shouldn't be that surprising. Number one, the NRSC has abandoned this race. Sam Brown is not getting national help. The Republicans, out of all these competitive seats, know that they don't need to win Nevada to get a majority. We still have 9 seats not filled in. The Republicans have other opportunities. Rosen is also a strong incumbent. Back in 2018, which granted was a Democratic wave year, she was able to beat the incumbent Republican senator here, Dean Heller, by over 5 points. I think she's an electoral force to be reckoned with, and I think she's basically going to outperform Harris in every part of the state. I also think the polls are going to be pretty accurate here. I'd say, again, she has an 85% chance of winning, and I would guess she wins by 8 points, although I could see a spread of 6 to 10 points for her being very reasonable. And finally, the last likely Democratic state we're going to talk about is Arizona. This is a state which I also think has an 85% chance of going blue. And why is that? Similar story to Nevada. Constant polling lead for the Democrats. You've never seen Kari Lake be competitive. And that's because Kari Lake is a uniquely bad candidate. It's not so much that Ruben Gallego is running this excellent race, although I do think his messaging is more effective than Lake's. It's more so that Lake is such a bad candidate. She is absolutely repellent to McCain voters in the suburbs. You have a lot of people who are willing to support Donald Trump who are not willing to support Kari Lake, even though she has strongly modeled herself off of being supportive of the former president. So when the only demographic you're going for is Trump voters and you can't even get all the Trump voters as we see here, Trump is narrowly leading in Arizona, you have a big delta against Kari Lake here. And so Gallego at 50% means, unless there's a big polling miss, he's pretty much clinched this regardless of how the margin turns out. Ultimately, I think Arizona is in the mid to high single digits for the Democrats. I think +7 for Gallego is going to be my call at this point, but I could see it ranging between 5 and 9 points. Now we're going to move on to the likely states for the Republicans. And just as we had the surprise in Maryland being competitive, if you haven't been paying attention, there are some surprising states we're going to get to in a bit. But a state that shouldn't be too surprising in this category is Florida. Florida, Rick Scott, the incumbent senator, is not all too popular. He had previously put out a plan which talked about sunsetting Social Security and Medicare every few years, which with senior voters, which make up a large percentage of Florida's constituency, obviously is not going to be popular. I expect him to run behind Trump in this state. However, polls, regardless of whether it's Trump or not, tend to, relative to other polling misses in the country, understate Republicans. So I think this polling basically functions as a lower bound for Scott rather than being closer to the middle like I have it for other races. Mucarsel-Powell is a pretty good candidate from what I understand. She escaped from Venezuela, so Scots and Republicans in Florida strategy of basically saying that Democrats are communists and pro-Cuba or pro-Venezuelan government is obviously not going to work with her, which is why I think you've seen this race be competitive. But let's not forget, Rick Scott is an electoral trooper despite not being that popular. He was able to defeat Bill Nelson in a Democratic wave year in Florida. And keep in mind, in 2018, this state had many fewer Republican voters than it has now. We've seen many Republicans move to this state across the past few years, moving it further to the right. So I think Rick Scott is able to win where it matters. That's why I think this is likely for him. I'd give him a 90% chance, and I think the race goes from anywhere from 4 to 8%, with him probably winning by 5 or 6, and I think Trump will outrun him by a few points. Up next, a surprising state, but even more surprising for the fact that, spoiler alert, I think it's slightly more certain than Nebraska, is Montana. Now, Montana is a state with the incumbent Democrat Jon Tester, and he's got an extremely uphill battle here. Montana is going to go to Trump by at the very least 15 points, but probably even a few more. So Tester will need something of a 15 plus point delta relative to Harris to win. And I just don't see that as happening. You have to go back to June. You have to go back to like early summer for Tester to be tied with Sheehy. They were tied through the summer. Since then, you see these little crocodile jaws, meaning Sheehy has just been doing better and better. I think partisanship in a race where I don't think it's going to be as polarized as 2020. I think you're going to see more ticket splitting than you did see in 2020, but still relative to America's recent past, a small amount of ticket splitting. Tester, I think, could get perhaps 1 in 10 voters for Trump, maybe even 1 in 8, but not enough to make up the 15 plus point gap that he's going to need to make up relative to Harris's performance. Really, all Sheehy needs to do is tie himself to Trump, and I think he's done fine. He is someone who moved to Montana. He wasn't born there, but I think he's shown enough appreciation for the state for Tester's attacks on him as a carpetbagger to not land enough for Tester to hold on to this seat. Yes, I'm aware that Tester won in 2018, but number one, it was only by 3 points, and this is with a highly skewed electorate. In terms of turnout in Montana, the exit polls only showed a Trump +5 electorate voting here in 2018, which is obviously much bluer than the state is as a whole. So were there presidential-like turnout in 2018? This race would have went Rosendale's way, and Rosendale is definitely a worse candidate than Sheehy is. So I feel pretty confident in Montana. Still still the closest race we've discussed so far. I think Sheehy has an 80% chance of winning. I would expect him to win by about 7 points. I think he's being slightly understated in the polls here, but this is also a state with high variance. I could see this being as close as 3 points or as dominant as 11 points, getting into the low double digits for Sheehy, similar to the race in 2020 here. The last likely state we're going to talk about is Nebraska, and this is the reason I have independents included in my ticker here, because I actually think there's a non-zero chance that the independent wins, but I still think it's a real uphill battle for Dan Osborn. Nebraska voted for Trump in 2020 by I believe between 19 and 20 points. It is a left trending state, so perhaps it's more like +16 or +17 for Harris. But even so, that's an even bigger delta than that needs to exist for Osborn relative to Harris than would need to exist in Montana. And in Montana, you actually have a Democratic incumbent in that state. Now, Osborn, he is not an incumbent, so that's a weakness for him relative to Tester, but a strength for him is that he's not a Democrat. He's kept things elusive about if he would caucus with the Democrats. I think generally his policy would lean more towards the Democrats, but he has successfully walked the line of making himself seem like a true independent. But even so, I just think Nebraska is too partisan of a state in a presidential election year for something like this to work. I get that Fischer is unpopular. She promised she would only run for 2 terms, and she is running for another term, and a lot of people don't like that. And if you look at the polling, you might say, hey, this is looking extremely close. But the reality is, basically none of these polls have any value because they're all internal polls, meaning they're all presumably biased towards either candidate. Now, if you just say, oh, the Fischer polls are plus a few extra for Fischer and the Osborn polls are a few extra for Osborn, that would put this race at about this polling average of Fischer +1. However, you have to factor in that there are so many undecideds, and in such a Republican state, the undecideds are going to go towards the Republican incumbent over this unknown independent candidate. That's the idea that undecideds are going to break for Osborn with it just doesn't seem like there's going to be enough Trump Osborn voters for him to actually pull this off. He would have to massively win all independent voters. He'd have to massively overperform, not only in the suburbs, but also in the massive Trump country of the western to central part of the state, which I just don't quite think he can pull it off. I'd also put this one around 80%, but this state, because of how uncertain it is, because of the polling average here, I'm going to give a huge gap. I'm going to say the most likely outcome is Fischer +8 or +9, but I'd range this with a long tail to the left, with this being as close as 2 points or as decisive as 12 points in Fischer's favor. But realistically, even though this looks close, we could be surprised. I am pretty skeptical that Osborn is actually going to be able to pull this off. Now we're getting into the lean category, and first we're going to start off with the Democrats. Out of these upper Midwest states, Michigan, I think, is looking the best for the Democrats. And going to the polling, we have a pretty respectable lead for Slotkin, 4.3 points. This is an open seat, so theoretically, the Republicans should be able to make this a good race. But Rogers, while not as bad of a candidate as Kari Lake, is not a very good candidate. He has not lived in the state for like 9 years. He moved to Florida. So already that doesn't look good for him. Slotkin has won competitive House races again and again in somewhat Republican leaning areas. She's able to overperform with moderate voters, and I think she's running a much smarter campaign. She doesn't have the Israel Gaza baggage that Harris does, so I think her numbers will be very good with Arab American voters. But even more so with her, I think she'll do better with rural voters than Harris will by a significant degree. Really, the only place where Rogers is going to outperform Trump is southwestern Michigan with Kent County and Ottawa County, and maybe run even with him in Oakland County. But I think Slotkin has strength there that probably won't happen. And in Ingham County, in Wayne County, and across the rural areas of the state, I think she'll overperform. So I actually think the polling is a lower bound for her. I'd say she wins by 5, but I'd say she wins by at least 4, and it could go, I'll give her a long tail on her upside, up to even 8 points for her. I don't think that's as likely as her winning by 4 to 6, but I think there's a chance that she significantly outruns Harris, and so I'd give her a 75% chance. Getting a little closer, we have the state of Pennsylvania. This is a state where Bob Casey, Democratic incumbent, is very popular, so in theory, this should be easy for him. He won by 13 points in 2018. Absolute blowout, right? Not close. Well, it turns out that Dave McCormick is actually, unlike a lot of Republicans, running a pretty good campaign. He's from Western PA, and even though he has connections to Connecticut, managing a fund, he seems to, while not necessarily getting all the rural anti-establishment voters that Trump is able to get, he seems to be doing pretty well in the suburbs. In southeastern Pennsylvania and western Pennsylvania and Pittsburgh, where he's from, as in west of Pittsburgh, I think he will actually outrun Trump, and I think this will be Casey's closest race so far. He isn't running as a pro-life Democrat like he used to be because of how abortion politics have changed. So I think socially conservative voters who previously might have backed him are no longer going to back him. But even so, he's still going to do well with rural voters and outperform Harris in Philadelphia enough to where I don't think there's too high of a chance McCormick will win. I'd give him a 30% chance, a little bit less than 1 in 3. So of course not unheard of, but I think Casey is the favorite here. I think Casey wins by 4 points here with a range of anywhere from D+2 to D+6, and again, I'd give him a 70% chance. The last lean D state for the Democrats is going to be Wisconsin, and this is a state that is really narrowing up. We're at only plus 2.9 for Baldwin. Hovde for a while did not seem like a very good candidate, but he's actually been able to get his act together. I think he's pretty successfully painted Baldwin as a career politician, highlighting her romantic partner, trading on certain topics that Baldwin is overseeing in terms of legislation. Hovde has also been able to keep this pretty close because he's, like McCormick, independently wealthy, so he's able to fund himself to the tunes of several $1,000,000. And basically, Baldwin's previous advantage with rural Wisconsinites relative to other Democrats seems to be waning. As you can see in 2018, she won almost all these all these counties in the driftless area that Donald Trump was able to win. And this time, it doesn't seem like she's going to be able to do that. But even so, I still think she'll outperform Harris in the driftless area. I actually think Hovde in the WOW counties might be able to slightly outperform Trump. I think those will trend in Harris's direction on the presidential level. But I think Hovde will do well in those counties, keeping this close. But I still think Baldwin has enough of an advantage with rural voters in a very rural state like Wisconsin to outperform Harris enough to win the seat. It's the closest yet. I'd give her a 65% chance in winning, meaning I think Hovde has a greater than 1 in 3 chance, which is certainly non-zero. But because of her strength with rural voters in the state, and Wisconsinites' clear backing of abortion rights. I mean, again, in these areas in the driftless area where Donald Trump won, you saw in the Supreme Court race in 2023 them still virtually all of them backing Protasewicz, the liberal candidate. So I think Baldwin on the right issues will be able to narrowly handle this race. I think the polls are pretty accurate here. I'd say Baldwin wins by 3, but I could see the range of anywhere from 1 to 5 points. So 1% is virtually a toss-up. If there's a slight polling miss in favor of Trump and Trump's momentum continues, this race might actually move into toss-up territory. But the fact that Baldwin is so close to 50%, I'm going to need to see more polls aside from Republican polls showing Havdi tied or up to move this out of the lean category. We've got one more. Well, before we continue, already, as you can see here, we have 50 seats for the Republicans. So if Trump were to win, the Republicans would have the Senate. This shows that with this map, since we're not even to toss-up states yet, it's basically guaranteed that Democrats have to win the presidency to hold the Senate, because this map, Democrats are clearly doing well compared to the presidential race. Montana, Nebraska, Nevada, Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio. The Democrats are all overperforming where I expect Harris to turn out. But it's just simply not enough when you have such difficult races for the Democrats to hold on to, like Ohio and Montana. But before we get to Ohio, which is going to be the only toss-up state, we have a lean state for the Republicans, and that's Texas. Colin Allred has made some missteps, but he seems to be running a pretty good race here, closing it up a little bit. Cruz is not particularly popular. Him being at only plus 3.4 suggests in the polls that he's going to have a delta with Trump of -2 to -3, which I think is pretty reasonable. So all it takes for this race to go blue is just a slight overestimation of Trump. If Trump doesn't improve again in the Rio Grande and he doesn't improve in Houston, whereas the Democrats improve in the Dallas area and the Austin area, then this seat could actually go blue. I still think it's a 75% chance for Cruz. But I do think it will be close, with perhaps a similar margin to what we saw in 2018. Because since 2018, the state has shifted left, and yes, this was a Democratic wave year. I think the map in Texas would look different. Cruz is going to do better in the Rio Grande Valley, but probably worse in these counties outside of Dallas. I think Colin and Denton County could actually go blue, and I think in these counties outside of Austin, you could see a similar thing. So really, this race is going to be determined by how much Cruz can improve in the Rio Grande Valley and if he can hold on in Houston. Houston could go either way. It did not trend as left in 2020 as Dallas and Austin, so it remains to be seen which way that goes. I can see good arguments for it going either way. So I still think Ted Cruz is going to win this state, but I think it could be pretty close. I think he probably wins it by 3 or 4 points, but I could see a range of anywhere from +2 to +6 for him, with again a 75% chance. Finally, and this gives Republicans an absolute presidency-proof majority. So Republicans don't even need to win any toss-up seats to win an absolute majority. That's how good this map is for them. So it would be a big fumble if Democrats were able to capture the majority in the Senate. But finally, we have our toss-up state of Ohio. And Ohio has gotten extremely close. We're now at 1.7%, which is tilting in Brown's direction, but a statistical dead heat. Additionally, neither candidate is close to 50. Brown isn't even at 48. When you have a state that Trump is probably going to win between 7 and 13%, you need to be at least 50% if you're Brown for people to feel comfortable picking you. That's why I think Moreno has a 57.5% chance of winning this seat. Brown will definitely overperform. In 2018, he was able to win this seat by 7 points, which is pretty impressive. He was able to almost recreate the Obama coalition in the state, so to speak, doing very well in these white working class areas in the Northeast, which are quickly trending away from from Democrats, and just in general, these rural margins are not as high as you're going to see with Trump. I think Brown will do better in the suburbs and in the rural areas, but the question is it enough? And I just don't think it's quite enough. Moreno, he's not a very good candidate. If you had Matt Dolan or Frank LaRose, I think this race could be in the lean Republican territory, but alas, when Trump's endorsement is king and he favors loyalty over candidate quality, that's what the Republicans are stuck with. And even so, I think they're going to narrowly pull it out. I would guess there's going to be a delta of about 8 points of Brown over Harris. So basically, this is a question of will Trump win Ohio by over 8 points? And it seems pretty likely at this point that Trump is going to do better in Ohio than he did in 16 or 20. Now, if he falters a little bit and only wins the state by 6 or 7, yes, I think Brown would be narrowly favored. And in my range for the state, I still have D+1 to R+3. So again, would I be surprised at all if Sherrod Brown wins? No, but I don't think incumbency will save him here. I just think the unpopularity of the Democrats and Moreno tying himself to Trump is just enough to flip the state in the Republicans' direction. So in the end, I think the Senate is going to be 52-48 in terms of the Republicans. Were the Democrats to have a path, number one, they'd have to flip Ohio, and then it's a question of Texas, Nebraska, or Montana. Obviously, I think Texas is the most likely for them. This is their best path to 50-50. Or there's a fluke in Nebraska and they get 49 with Osborn and they have to give a lot of concessions to Osborn, but Osborn goes along with them. That's the path that they have, but I just don't think it's very likely. At this point, I'd give the Republicans probably a 75% chance of winning the Senate. It's definitely leaning in their direction. It's not quite likely because all it takes is a slight polling miss and Ohio and potentially Texas are gone for them. So that 50-50 scenario plus Democrats winning the presidency is a real possibility. I would not be completely shocked to see that. But I think Republicans, especially just with Texas alone, will be able to capture an absolute majority in the chamber. That's going to be it. I might put out another one of these before Election Day, but if not, this is my final official Roman election forecasting prediction for the U.S. Senate outcome in 2024. Let me know what you think. Do you think that Brown is going to lose in Ohio? Do you think we're going to see an upset in Nebraska? Or do you think we're going to see in some of these races where polling has been good for Democrats a Republican upset? These things are all possible. That's why predicting elections is so fun, because sometimes you get results that just it seems like no one except for a crazy person could predict. I'm playing it pretty safe this time though, and I'm getting a 52-48 margin for the Republicans. That's going to be it for this video. Until next time.